In this second video on James Madison, we'll look at the causes of the War of 1812, how Madison handled things as relations deteriorated. Jefferson certainly had left Madison a pretty tenuous situation. He'd passed the Embargo Act of 1807 right before he left office, and that had declared that the United States would trade with no European countries. And, that kind of ensured that the economy was tenuous. And, Madison was still facing the problem of maintaining neutrality as the British and French fought. So not surprisingly, as Madison's early years were dominated by foreign policy. His first action was to institute the Non-Intercourse Act, which declared that the United States would trade with all countries but Britain and France. It promised that if either of them would lift their restrictions on trade, the U.S. would open trade with their country as well. And this is the beginning of what is a rather convoluted way of dealing with neutral trading rights. Well, the British replied that, okay, they'd lift their orders in council, but then they reneged. They said their foreign minister had been misunderstood. Madison, therefore, then shifted strategy. He supported Macon's Bill No. 2, and again, a rather convoluted piece of legislation that declared that the United States would now reopen trade with both France and Great Britain, but if either of them would then lift their own restrictions on trade, the U.S. would stop trading with their enemies. So Madison was coming at the same problem from a different angle. In response to Macon Bill No. 2, the French leader Napoleon tried to pull a fast one. His foreign minister, Cador, promised to lift the French restrictions on trade known as the Continental System, and Madison quickly agreed therefore to stop trading with Britain, as he said he would in the Macon's Bill No. 2. But then in a subsequent letter known as the Cador letter, Napoleon then explained that France would only lift its continental system when Britain first had lifted its trading restrictions, known as the Orders in Council. Madison, however, refused to repeal his decision. He was going to stick with what he just said, undoubtedly still hoping to pressure Britain to lift their restrictions. So Madison decided to continue his course, but his continued pressure on Britain didn't get Britain to lift its restrictions on trade, its orders in council. So Madison then asked for a declaration of war against Great Britain. It was really a huge missed opportunity, because while the declaration passed on June 18, 1812, the British had, in fact, lifted the orders in council a few days earlier, but word had not yet reached America. Now, one could say, therefore, that the War of 1812 was avoidable. And, there's some truth in that. But, that is to ignore that there are other factors leading to war than just a single issue of trade. As the British and the French were still fighting and the British needed sailors, they had continued their policy of impressing American merchant marine sailors, boarding ships and forcing them into the British Navy. And this continued to anger Americans towards Britain. Another problem was that the British continued to arm Native Americans around the Great Lakes, still trying to protect their fur business in the area, despite having surrendered much of the land to the U.S. in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and also having promised to do so with Jay's Treaty in 1795. By 1811, it appeared that the British were encouraging a Shawnee warrior, Tecumseh, who had begun plans to unite all the Native American nations in the area in a combined resistance against the United States. The governor of the Indiana Territory then, a man named William Henry Harrison, tried to negotiate with Tecumseh, and he pronounced Tecumseh, quote, one of those uncommon geniuses who springs up occasionally to produce revolutions and overturn the established order of things, unquote. Obviously, he had some high opinion of Tecumseh, but those negotiations were unfruitful, and therefore he decided to gather a force of about 1,000 militia and set about to attack Tecumseh's capital, which was known as Prophetstown on the Tippecanoe River. That's in northern Indiana, right real near the Canadian border. Harrison won the battle that resulted, the Battle at Tippecanoe, and Tecumseh fled to Canada. That also increased American suspicions that the British were really behind it all. Harrison, of course, became another military hero for America, and later on he would run for president. His vice president was known as named John Tyler, and their slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, but that's later in American history. The British probably weren't directly behind Tecumseh's efforts, but it didn't prevent a group of men in Congress and leaders in the states from saying that they were indeed still behind it. These men were fanning the flames of anger at the British, and they were sort of demanding war. They were called the War Hawks. They pointed out that Tecumseh had, in fact, been using British rifles, if not getting direct coordination with the British. These guys were young men. They were too young for the revolution, and they really wanted to make a name for themselves. They really wanted the United States as well to take over Canada. For much of the nation, certainly for these war hawks, Britain seemed to be dismissing the United States as a real nation. They had a sense that the U.S. hadn't really won independence. Britain just had sort of temporarily let them loose. With impressment, many of these war hawks felt America's national honor was at stake, and we needed to vindicate and prove our sovereignty and independence once and for all. Among these war hawks were young men that later on became towering figures in American history. For example, there was Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Both of them would play a role as the American Civil War approached. In the end, of course, not all Americans supported the declaration of war. The maritime states of New York and in New England, traditionally Federalist, and the regions that bore the brunt of the British attacks on American trade gave their votes against the declaration. But the growing western states and southern states, however, proved more than enough to pass the vote, and so America went to war in the War of 1812. The war is going to go on for several years, but is known as the War of 1812. Here you can see a Northern Federalist cartoon against the war. It shows Washington and Heaven upset that the U.S. was involving itself in foreign wars. This concludes the short video on the coming of the War of 1812.